I've given up very, very early on any attempt to give a proper talk in the sense of a lecture where you present people with a very articulate argument about something and you come and invade their brains with quotations from the Holy Fathers. I've given that up for two reasons. First of all, I'm not made up for it. And secondly, that never works for me. I've never grown by listening to an academic lecture. And I've had the opportunity to study and to teach in the best academic environment in Britain for 7 years. I've always grown from a simple human being who managed to put into simple words his own or her own experience, even to the risk of making himself or herself vulnerable. And it's from this opening of one's heart that I've learned and I've benefited most. And this is what I try to do whenever I'm forced to address an audience, be it live like we are now today, or through my phone from my cell on the Isle of Mull. Lent has been and still is for me this extraordinary gift that Christ is giving me every year despite me not deserving it. It's this time that is set aside for me to experiment. I think of Lent as an spiritual laboratory. That's the word, that's the expression that comes back to me all the time. A spiritual laboratory, a time, a limited time, where I can try out, I can contemplate and experiment the things that I read in the Holy Fathers, but I'm afraid to apply in my life permanently. Lent has this great advantage of lasting just for 40 days. So no matter what kind of fasting you are going to attempt, it's not going to kill you. I'm yet to meet anyone who's dead because of fasting. But I've met a lot of people who are badly ill and sick because of the way they eat. But the idea of applying a strict type of fasting in your life for the rest of your life, or the idea of maybe setting up a rule of prayer where you wake up in the middle of the night for half an hour or an hour, and you want to do that for the rest of your life, that scares a lot of people, including myself, because the rest of our lives, even if we are in our 70s or 80s, somehow seems very, very long, although the reality is that it's not that long. But Lent has this advantage of coming back every year, and it only lasts for a limited amount of time. So I know that even if I'm going to get very, very hungry, or even if I'm going to get very tired, even if my mind is going to get confused because I break my sleep and I don't get the uninterrupted sleep I depend upon, it's only 40 days. And after the 40 days, I can go back to my usual self. Now, of course, as I tell you these things, I'm aware that I'm lying to you. Because if indeed you were to experience fasting and prayer and vigil in a real deep meaning during Lent, it is unavoidable that something of that experience would travel with you outside Lent and would enrich your life outside Lent. So what I want you to do is I want you to treat Lent as this box of time, a space where you can play spiritually. Think of your favorite saint, male or female, and try to imitate them. Think, for instance, of the example of Saint Seraphim of Viritsa, who loved Saint Seraphim of Sarov so much that he did the same type of prayer that Saint Seraphim did in the forests of Russia, but he did it in his back garden. Try to think of your favorite saint, the way they prayed, the way they fasted, the way they kept vigil, the way they related to other people, and try to apply that for those 40 days in your life. There's nothing novel in any of this. I'm certain you realize that. The Desert Fathers, for instance, they all did this, and they treated Lent precisely as a spiritual laboratory. If you think, We are going to read the life of Saint Mary of Egypt during Lent. But there is another saint in that story, Saint Zosimas. And if you pay attention, at the very beginning of the life of Saint Mary, we learn that all the monks in Egypt, and definitely the monks in Saint Zosimas' monastery, at the beginning of Lent, they would go into the desert. And they would spend the 40 days of Lent all alone in the desert, fighting their own demons and coming back to be together for the resurrection. What I suggest to you today is simply a tamed version of what those saints were doing centuries, millennia ago. There's nothing new about taking time to fast to a more extreme or a more, I don't like the word extreme because there's nothing extreme about what we can do. It's almost, embarrassing to use the word, but to fast a bit more seriously or to pray a bit more seriously. We see even Christ doing it. And if Christ does something, and if the holy apostles have decided that that is something that needs to be kept to our memory, that's not by accident. It's not accidental that Christ goes to fast and pray for 40 days. It is for us to see it, and it is for us to try to imitate that to the best of our ability. And just as an aside, by the grace of God, myself and the community on Mal, we had the great blessing of going on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. It was something we prayed for and saved for and prepared for many years. And one of the places that scared me in a most physical way almost was the monastery built on the Mount of Temptations. Those of you who've been there may have seen that place and have felt the same thing. It's not that the place is scary or that it's desolate. Everything is scary and desolate. It's a desert. There's no sign of life of any kind. It's beyond me how anything, let alone a human being, can survive there. But what was shocking to me was how far away, how remote that place was, and how difficult I found it to be there for about an hour, being driven in a car and carrying water with me. The idea of a human being, Christ, traveling to be so remote, so far away, and then starting to fast, knowing as I know that after 3 days I can barely move my legs, after 3 days of no food and no water, I then realized that Christ's fasting had a lot to do with entrusting himself to God entirely. Because 1 week into his fast, if he had decided, I cannot do this, I need to go back, that would have been impossible. It is impossible to go back. Once you engage in that sort of spiritual battle that Christ is placing before our eyes, it is impossible to stop. If you stop, what happened to St. Peter walking on the water happens to you as well. If you stop and you pay attention and you get distracted by your own fears, you will drown. And the only way forward is to be completely abandoned, to give yourself entirely, to jump into Christ's arms and trust against all evidence that he will carry you forward. So Lent is this gift, this spiritual lab that God gives us every year for us to investigate and experiment our life of prayer and our vigil and our Lent, our fasting. But it is also a time, and this is the main thing I want to communicate to you today, a time for us to go back to our correct, orthodox vision of what the world is all about and why we are, who we are, and whom we are supposed to become. It is a time for us to go back to a remembrance of our calling, the height of our calling, and also the depth of our failure to meet that calling. We very often, I don't want to say always, although from my experience it actually is always, except maybe for the great saints, but we almost always tame down, reduce down our vocation. We learn to strive to become something less than what Christ sets before us as our aim. And it is important, I would repeat that every day, even if it's simply mere empty theory for a while. It is important to hold on to the understanding that we are created to be one with God. We are created to be God in the sense that everything God is by nature, we are called to become by grace, by gift. There is nothing that Christ is that we are not called to be as well. We are called to partake of every single attribute that we see in God, that God has in virtue of His divine nature. The only difference is that instead of us partaking in virtue of our nature, we partake in virtue of the grace that we are given as a gift from God. That's who we are created to become. And anything lower than that, even if it sounds beautiful, even if it's embraced and applauded by those around us and by the church itself sometimes, it is a good stop, but it is not the aim. And it is important to hold on to this as much as it is important to acknowledge the fact that this calling by ourselves is impossible to achieve. Because if you think you can achieve it by yourself, then it's not something that is properly of God. It is still something that is properly of you. So you've not yet made that jump between the things that belong to human nature, fallen human nature, and the things that belong to the nature of God. Father Sophrony, Saint Sophrony, I need to get used to that, of Essex, used to describe this battle of ours, the battle for the impossible, by saying that we Orthodox Christians in the world, we are like drops of water that are part of an ocean in the process of freezing. The world is a freezing ocean, and we are those tiny drops here and there that struggle not to freeze with the ocean. That is impossible. And yet in Christ, what is impossible for us is perfectly possible. And I've recently, about a month ago, had this, you know how we all have our personal revelations. There was an image that I've held on to for reasons that I didn't understand until about a month ago. This image of my grandmother dying. I shared this online. I remember when my grandmother died, my mom's mom, that she had a stroke. Many in our family die because of strokes. Her body was dead. The doctors had told us hours before that there's nothing to be done. There's no way they can intervene to save my grandmother's life. Except that in that dead, dying body of hers, in the middle of that corpse that she was becoming, her heart refused to stop beating. This was a corpse, a dead human being with a heart that was so madly in love with life that refused to stop beating. And I remember I was a teenager at the time. I remember being so confused and struck by that somehow that image just entered my heart, and I traveled with that image all these decades until about a month or two ago, reading again what Saint Sophrony says about these drops of water in the freezing ocean, I realized that God was teaching me in my teen years the same thing by looking at that beating heart, at that cluster of cells in a dead body that, against all logic and reasoning and hope, refused to die, to refuse to let go, refuse to stop beating. And it's important that we hold on to this understanding that by ourselves to achieve the height of our calling is impossible. This is not a metaphor. It is impossible. And it is only by holding on to Christ and only by doing all the things we've learned in the experience of 2,000 years of this church that we can open up to receive Christ in ourselves. And by His grace, what is impossible becomes possible. Because there are glimpses that we are given to what this looks like in the lives of the saints. I love when Saint Silouan talks about those moments when he experiences the divine grace, the divine light, and sometimes he says, if that experience had been prolonged for only a few seconds more, I don't think I could have survived it. That's so beautiful. That's like divine possession. And in fact, what he's possessed by is not something that's foreign to him, is not some sort of alien entity. He is possessed by his own self in its perfect actualization. He is possessed by his own human nature, the way it is called to become. And that is so different, so powerful, so out of this world, that even someone so perfect as Saint Silouan says that a few seconds more, and I doubt I could have survived that experience of my true self. The minute we lower this calling, the minute we try to make peace logically between this calling being impossible and our need to actually reach it, that's the minute we've failed. Now, the very good question, of course, is isn't this the vision that we should hold on to always? And the answer is yes. But the reality again, and I'm someone who always encourages you not to lie to yourselves, but to be painfully honest to yourselves. The reality is that we don't. We very rarely actually allow ourselves to contemplate the height of our calling or the depths of what missing on that calling could mean. Why? Why do we kind of tame it down? Why, instead of having this vision of lions, we allow ourselves to become spiritual chihuahuas? Well, there are some reasons. And there are some very serious, difficult reasons for that. There are forces in this world, spiritual forces in this world, which are always demonic, that go about doing two things at the same time and through different tools. One force is trying to get us as far away from Christ as possible, whereas the other set of forces is trying to get us as close to the devil as possible. And I want to briefly talk about that because it's important. Again, if you don't know your enemy, it is much more probable that you're going to collapse as you battle that enemy. And I think this is where we should start. The world today, and it has always been like this, but today somehow it feels like the tools of these theories have been perfected. The world today has a wealth of offering of false fears, false enemies, false demons, false aims. We are being fed constantly enemies that then we are being taught to hate. We are being fed constantly ideologies which then we are presented in a way and we are being taught to hate. We are being distracted, not in the sense of having fun, not that sense of a distraction, but in the sense of being distracted from the real enemy. So we look at all these false fears, false enemies, and false battles. The problem with all the conspiracy theories that surround our lives, from major ones that have taken over the whole world to localized ones where, I don't know, your local paper will tell you that there is a demonic bunny, that if the bunny looks at you, you are going to have a chip implanted in your brain. There are a lot of people who believe that. A lot of people who believe similarly idiotic things, but they believe them. And that's the problem. It's not about judging their belief. It's about acknowledging that they believe them, and all of us, to some degree, have bought into this. And the real spiritual problem with all these conspiracy theories is that they teach us to use a tremendous weapon that God gave us, hatred, against another human being, or another idea or ideology or politics and so on, instead of using it the one way that Christ is showing us we need to use it, against the devil. Of course that there are a collection of horrible ideas in the world, of horrible ideologies, and people who have signed up, unfortunately, to them. Of course, I'm not being blinded to the reality of this world. But what I'm trying to help you do is cut through all of it and realize that the real enemy is not the world or any aspect of the world, but the devil. Because if we fear where there is no fear, as Saint David says in the Psalter, it is very easy for the evil one to attack from the left or from the right and to have us completely defeated. That's the risk of distraction. To be distracted in the sense of being refocused on using your hatred on anything but the devil. There's also the more subtle distraction of civilized, good citizens. And those are more difficult for me to approach because it's more difficult for me to approach them. It's that gospel when everybody's called to join the wedding and everybody finds an excuse not to go. What's striking to me in a painful, fearful way is that none of their reasoning is wrong. None of those people say, I'm not coming to the wedding because I want to go out and play poker, or I want to go out and get drunk, or I want to go out and spend my time with prostitutes. None of them is doing something wrong. They're all having the excuses which were blessed by God. I'm not coming because I just bought some oxen and I have to work, or I've bought land and I have to, work the land, or I've gotten married, I have to care for my family. All of these things are good, blessed things. But even these things, if they become distractions in the sense of distracting us from focusing on Christ, if they take central stage in our lives, they also become tools not for our salvation, but the other way around. Every aspect of our life should become a spiritual tool, an emotional tool, a physical tool to help us in our spiritual life. We should be focused on the real enemy, not any enemies that we are being served at the buffet of life. And we should also be focused and strive and try, because it is difficult to have Christ as the axis, the criterion of everything in our life. Not our careers, not our families, not our health, not our status. Because by the end of this life, going back to our calling, we should not be a perfect mother or father, or a perfect dentist, or a perfect lawyer. We are called to be saints. And being a mother or a father, being a friend, being a lawyer or being a cleaner or being a dentist is nothing but your way, your tool, your journey to achieve the aim. Don't turn a tool into the aim of your life. That's also a distraction, but in a different, more subtle sort of way. before I stop, I also want to say something about how on earth can we use Lent in order for us to go back to this vision? And how on earth can we use Lent so we can let go of these distractions from the real aim and the real enemy? And for me, the answer has always been obvious, and that is withdrawal. I see it in the scripture. I see Christ teaching us again and again that the way forward is to withdraw from the world. He tells us that much. He says, when you pray, don't go out into the streets, but go into your door and go into your room and close that door and pray in secret. He teaches us with his words. And then, because he knows how silly we are as students, he also shows us again and again by withdrawing himself. Every time something major is about to happen, and every time after something major has happened, he steps away from the town, from the city, from the village, from his own disciples, and finds a remote place somewhere where he is alone, just himself and the Father. And even if he takes some disciples with him, he only goes as far with them. And then he takes only 3 and goes as far, and then even those 3 are left behind. So he is indeed alone with God the Father. And I'm perfectly aware of the reality of your lives. I'm perfectly aware that many of you live in cities and you have jobs and you have families, that many of you are now at an age where you can't just go and be alone somewhere for a month, or your health doesn't allow you to do that. But we can all do that which we can do. And Christ is never going to judge us because we don't do something that he knows better than we do was impossible to us. The problem is that we do not do that little thing which is in our strength, in our ability to do. You all have some sort of a garden, even a small garden. You all have some shed maybe in your garden. Or if you don't have a shed, maybe you can go camping for a day. Or maybe you can just take your tent outside and put it in your garden. It sounds silly, but being outside your house, physically removed from your house, from your family, even if it's just 10, 20 meters away from them, and being enclosed in a small space like a shed or like a tent, something temporary, something like our life, everything then just gets a different coloring, and there is a wealth of understanding that is just downloaded into you. Or if you don't have even that, as I know is the case for many people today, if you don't have the smallest garden, you can still wake up in the middle of the night. You can still put in the effort to wake up when it's pitch dark outside, pitch dark in your room, everybody's asleep, you know the world is asleep, or the world is doing the things of the darkness. And there in the darkness, you can be alone with Christ. You do not even have to pray per se. You don't have to turn your lights on in order for you to read canons or akathist or the Psalter or anything. You don't even have to say what you know by heart. Just stand before an icon. Just light a candle before an icon and allow that candle, allow that effort of keeping yourself standing before an icon to become your prayer. That silence, if God blesses it and if God steps in to pour his grace upon you, that silence, that lack of words can become the most intimate, the most powerful, the most genuine experience of prayer we have experienced. There's nothing to stop us from finding a place or a situation where we can withdraw from the world. You can always do it, and you have to do it. Trust me. It's something I encourage you. There's nothing I can do. I'm not even your spiritual father or your parish priest or anything to you. I'm just a stranger. And it would be much easier for me to gather your support if I told you we have to do nothing except maybe make a donation to the monastery, and then you are going to be saved. It would be so much easier for me and for the monastery to survive. But I trust that Christ is here today, and I want him to know that I offer you the depth of my heart, because I know, once again, that's how I've grown, and I know that's the only way we can grow. There are ways in which you can do this. You don't have to be in your 20s with perfect health. Just by waking up, or just by using insomnia, which is a gift of old age, as I'm beginning to discover more recently, just by using that gift the proper way, you can actually regain your time. You can buy back your time. And finally, withdrawal from the world doesn't just mean to physically leave the world, because you can be as remote as you wish. You can be as far as, the Isle of Mull. If in your mind you are still caught up in the world, that withdrawal will not do its job. That's why actually I'm a strong believer of actually forcing yourself to be awake, because your brain is so tired that it doesn't have the energy to hold on, to grasp the world. But what I'm trying to say is that even if you make that step and you create that space where you are alone with Christ, physically alone, if you hold on to the world, you're not making the most of it. And the real virus, the real pandemic, the real spiritual pandemic of our world is judgment. Judging the world. Judging the world is the virus, the most difficult virus that we find impossible almost to cure within ourselves. Because we are being taught from the right, from the church, that we need to judge. It's actually our misunderstanding of what the fathers are teaching us. And also the devil is very interested that we judge. Because the devil doesn't care if you like him or not. He doesn't care if you abuse him and you spit on him and you curse him and you call him whatever names you want, or if you embrace him and you worship him. As long as your mind is engaged either way with things of the world, you're caught in the devil's trick. Because as long as your mind is involved and caught in the world, your mind is not yet withdrawn from the world, so it cannot engage and be caught by Christ. Judgment is, from my perspective, my very limited experience, the most important thing we all have to fight against. More than our greed, more than our lust, more than anything else, if we manage to fight against judgment, if we manage to go through the world and only see the seeds that Christ has planted, not the devil, then we have a great hope and chance of salvation. I want to give you some examples from my beloved saints, the saints of the Isles. And the best example is them arriving to the Scottish Isles and seeing those Pictish tribes. Those were the definition of violent pagan tribes. Their religion was pagan. They were still practicing sacrifices, including human sacrifices. If you come and visit us, if you come to one of our pilgrimages, you'll see on Iona, on Mull, on St. Brendan's Island, everywhere around, you'll see these high places that are still marked to this day, where the places of sacrifices used to be. Because their god was the sun, and they were offering these sacrifices to their God. So the higher, the more physically closer they were to their God, the more, a chance that the God received the sacrifice. And yet somehow, these saints managed to convert these barbarians without one battle or one martyr. The martyrs came much, much later when they were invaded by the Vikings. But the process of conversion from this violent God that demanded human sacrifices to a God whose only definition is love and who sacrifices himself for us, this process of conversion happened without any violence, any battle, any martyr. And that's because they had Christ's eyes looking upon those barbarians. They did not see the 99% of darkness and evilness that was present in them. They saw and they focused on the 1% that was light. They identified those seeds that were planted by Christ in their hearts, and they nourished those seeds. Because even if we were to go to the deepest forest anywhere in this world, and we were to meet a human being who had never seen another man or woman, we would still not be there first. Christ has already been there. Christ has been there. He has created them out of love. His seed of love is in them, and he has the same aim for them as for us, to save them. So these saints coming from Ireland, instead of telling them, you are heretical, you are condemned to hell because you worship this bloodthirsty created God, the Son, they taught them that the Son, their God, was right. The right God, because it was everything they could achieve before the revelation of Christ. But once the true Son, not the physical Son, but the Son of righteousness was revealed, then there's no need anymore to worship that Son. That was good in the past. Now we need to move into the fullness of the revelation. And that's why you end up with the Celtic cross, where you have a cross and a sun in the middle, because that sun is a representation of Christ crucified. God crucified on the language according to the understanding of those pagan tribes. They didn't tell them, all your sacrifices are satanic sacrifices. They told them, all your sacrifices are just shadows of the truth. But once God himself, incarnate, sacrificed himself for us, what are the human being? What are the offering more pure or more valuable can you offer? So without denying their identity, they found ways to fulfill those seeds in them and to bring them to Christ. There are stories about St. Herman of Alaska that are very, very similar, the way that he evangelized in Alaska. There are stories up to our time. Saint Sophronia of Essex. He was scandalous for the Orthodox at his time. As he was walking the streets of London and he was making the sign of the cross, big sign of the cross, like a proper, Russian monk from the Holy Mountain. Every time he passed a Catholic church or an Anglican church, and all those people around him were scandalized. Why do you do that? They're not Orthodox. And he said, I don't know what you see, but what I see is the cross upon which my God was crucified for my sins. So you have two human beings walking the same space, same streets at the same time, but you have two different visions. One, the vision of the world, which is sick with this virus of judgment, who selects everything that is dark in the world and then focuses on that darkness. And then you have the vision of a saint who sees none of that but the light and the seeds of Christ. And we are all caught in a process of becoming. That story from Genesis, that we were made into the image of God to become into his likeness, applies to us today and will apply until the very end of the world. We are not finished. If you are 16 or 60 or 96 or whatever, you are not finished. You are still an embryo in a spiritual womb. You are still growing. You are still becoming, because you are called to reflect that image of God and to grow into its fullness. And the reality is, and I'll finish with this, the reality is that we become that image which we reflect. If we go through the world focusing on darkness and reflecting darkness, we are going to become in the image of darkness and partake of darkness. But if you go through this world, as Saint Paisius, I think, used to say, like a bee, and you just select the goodness, the seeds of Christ, the light in this world, and you surround yourself with light, and you reflect light upon yourself, then you will become in the image of light, and you will partake of light itself.